So the North American Championships have come and gone, but what does that specifically mean? What kind of deck lists are we looking at here? And what does this mean now for the future of the meta? All of that and more starting now. So the NA Championships, of course, ended up going over 3 days, and it was a pretty interesting competition here that we had going on. I mean, it started with the last chance qualifier, where people were able to get in and try to really prove that they had what it takes to try to make it into the North American Championships. At the same time, after that, then they had 2 days of grueling contest, where they ended up going in a Swiss round, and then following that, once they were in a top 32, would work in until we, of course, had a championship. Or champion in that case. So it was a very long couple of days for a lot of people there, and it was really interesting actually to see how the conversion weights ended up going for us, especially with all the deck lists. Now, one thing that I will have to say in the beginning, first and foremost, is that the meta right now is very wide for the most part. Asterisk there. Keep that in mind. Because why I say for the most part is because, yes, while there were a lot of decks that came and showed up, we had 10 deck types that showed up to the NA Championships, which is absolutely amazing to see. That's exactly what you want to see in a healthy card game, and it's amazing that we're even able to have that wide of a meta. At the same time, though, what you also got to take a look at and things that you need to consider as well is that everything did, of course, converge into day 2, and the conversion rates were not as good as you would necessarily think. At the same time, with the conversion rates, of course, day 1 to day 2 was really interesting. In particular, the Ruby Amethyst going from day 1 to day 2. Now, why is that, do you think? Well, the interesting thing is, of course, the guy that won the Texas LCQ and everything ended up actually taking it. Ed, really cool guy, awesome player, knows the game beyond what we probably even will ever comprehend. But at the same time, with that, he did an absolutely amazing job just being able to use his deck to utilize it to the best of his ability to be able to get ahead and to ultimately take out his opponent. Now, the interesting thing is there was a couple of things that he did really interesting with his gameplay, and we'll take a look at that as well. But there's also a really interesting thing that he did with his deck type that helped him better prepare for this meta that we have out on the board right now. But we'll take a look at that later. The main thing I really want to pinpoint here, though, is that Ruby Amethyst literally had the worst day 1 to day 2 conversion percentage. Out of all of the decks, and it was the second most represented deck in this meta, out of all of those decks, he was the only one of Ruby Amethyst that made it to day 2. Even Blurple did better than that. And I mean, Blurple, especially with the showing that it had, very impressed with it. I would say instead of, it being in the tier 2 style, I would say it's on the lower end of tier 1. It's there in tier 1, but it's just not quite having the final oomph to really get past the finish line here. Yes, we've seen it been able to take a couple of tournaments and whatnot, but overall, though, it just feels like a lot needs to go its way in order for it to do well on a consistent basis. And if it misses any of those key moments, it's done. At the same time, I feel like that's kind of the same way that Discard is as well, and we see that with Emerald Steel. They did actually a pretty good job going pretty far. That's the biggest thing, though, with that is that you need to kind of rely on your draw power. You need to rely on the cards that you're able to pull, and if you miss out on those crucial cards, then Emerald Steel is just going to fall out as well. That's just how it is. But yeah, so it's a really interesting game that we have going on right now, and the finals was actually really interesting to be able to see a Ruby Sapphire with a Ruby Amethyst fighting in a best of 5. Now, with that though, Ed of course did a really great job being able to control the field, get ahead early on, maintain good draw power, and just showed basically, like the commentator said, a masterclass on what you really need to do to be able to pilot this deck incredibly well and incredibly efficient. Even if you don't necessarily have the best of draws, you're still able to do a lot of really amazing things with this deck and utilize your lines incredibly well. Now, I'm also really curious, though, about Ruby Sapphire because it did a really good job as well. I mean, it was the number 1 most represented deck, which was something that did catch me off guard. I didn't actually expect that or, thought I would actually see that. I thought, Ruby Sapphire was good, but it wasn't as great as it used to be. And it turns out that, I might have actually been wrong about that, and, 100% able to accept that. But it still seems like that it is one of the most popular decks that are still out in the meta right now, which is really good to see, somewhat, just because it was still such a dominant deck. And it was more so that we saw people actually preparing more to go against Ruby Sapphire, even more so than Amber Steel, which really caught me off guard because I thought Amber Steel would be the number one deck that we would actually see represented, either equally or just a little bit more than Ruby Amethyst. I thought Ruby Amethyst was going to be the number one most represented deck, especially when looking at the ink decks that we had out there. Just a lot of really interesting things going on with it. And, we've been seeing it entered into a lot of tournaments, and we've seen them placing pretty high, but not a whole ton of Ruby Sapphire, which was really interesting. And we even didn't really see a whole ton of Ruby Sapphire even winning tournaments necessarily. We would see maybe one or two that would place high, but it's kind of like the Amethyst Steel style of decks, where you see it actually perform well. It gets normally fifth in a lot of the tournaments, of the bigger tournaments on ink decks. You see it getting fifth with Amethyst Steel, and it does a really good job with that, but that's about it. It hasn't actually really won a bigger tournament yet. It's performed well, but it hasn't actually won. And like we saw today with the Amethyst Steel deck, is that if you end up missing a little bit of your draw, if you end up not starting the best, then your deck can really struggle and you almost defeat yourself. Even more than, like, yes, your opponent can draw bad too and things like that. Not going to discount that. But it feels like if your deck as Amethyst Steel player ends up falling short, and you really can miss the momentum early on in your game, if you're not able to utilize that fully, then you really start to struggle and fall short to the point where you end up falling just completely behind and defeat yourself. So just a lot of really interesting games that we had today. And we're going to go ahead and take a look at a couple of deck lists right now. So first and foremost, this of course is the top 16 rankings, not as they necessarily were, but just the 16 decks as they were at the end of day one. So that's really good to see. Now, of course, ignore the placements of it. Edmund Shu in the top 8, of course, but he ended up actually winning it, and he's in the top 8. So ignore that. But the biggest thing that I really want to take into consideration as well too is that, look at this meta right here. Look at where we're standing, where we actually have a pretty good showing from pretty much every major or main deck, except maybe necessarily EA and Discard. Everything else is actually pretty well represented. And I really do like also where kind of Amber Steel is as well, where we have even multiple versions of Amber Steel that are performing really well. So much like Dwarven Mine, and Steel Song and, things of that nature are actually doing pretty good in this meta, which is absolutely crazy and awesome to see. But at the same time, all the Amber Steel players, when it came time to actually perform in the, top 16, top 8, things of that nature, a lot of them ended up actually getting beaten, especially by Popsicles, which was really interesting to be able to see that, the Ruby Sapphire deck actually ended up still, even though, like, people might be able to come out on the aggro side going, that people were still able to actually go ahead and take care of their board in an efficient way. And to ultimately dominate the in game after that. So just really interesting to be able to see. The biggest thing that I'm just seeing here is that, again, like I said, this meta is very wide open, which is very awesome to see. So with that though, let's go ahead and look at Edmund Shu's deck list right here. Now, this is also a really cool and kind of crazy thing as well. The fact that he only spent, necessarily $145 on his deck list. That's amazing. The fact that you're able to only spend that much money and have a deck that took literally the NA championships is absolutely amazing. Now, it's really interesting here to also see that, he had 12 1-drops. That's very interesting as well. And he had, Flynn Rider, very smart choice, very dominant card, especially even if it can just gain you 3. that can be an absolute game changer. But at the same time, we didn't necessarily see it being activated all that much on the upkeeps, even with, the Sisus in the deck as well. But at the same time, it's still a good thing because your opponent almost has to even play around it and would even possibly even make sacrifices on inking certain cards to try to get the Sisu lower so that you could then, you know, not gain the 3. So it's like they almost still have to find a way to play around it and sacrifice. Flynn, of course, does get removed pretty easily with all the removal that we have, especially with how much steel is out there. Very easy way to get things removed. Also with, with how much ruby is out there as well, brawls and all of that jazz are very easy to take them out. At the same time, though, it's just really interesting to see how this deck actually performed. And 2 crab, cool, that's fine. Normally people are running 3 or 4. He went with 2. And then the biggest thing, though, that was really interesting, though, was 4 rabbit, 0 genie. 0 genie. Now, why do I think he decided to go on that route? And I really just think that it comes down to removal. The biggest thing with Genie is you go ahead and you play the Genie, and every time that you play the Genie, if he gets removed, if he gets bounced back, it's paying 4 to draw 1 card, and that absolutely hurts. It's not worth the cost. Genie, yes, if he is able to actually activate his ability, and then on the following turn gain you 2 lore, that can be an absolute game changer, especially if your opponent doesn't have the answers. At the same time, the big thing with Rabbit, though, is if you go ahead and play Rabbit, you bring him into play, draw a card, he gets bounced out, he gets banished, doesn't matter, you still draw 1 card. That's a little bit better because then, of course, you're getting a little bit more utilization from him, which is really good to see, and, just having a lot more help in that realm. Now, at the same time, one thing that was also really interesting, no Madame Medusas. Now, why do I think that is? It's the big reason why I think that is, and especially with watching the gameplay, is that the Lady Tremaine, the biggest thing was it was thinning the board, which was very important. Even if you were necessarily going for a 2-cost Ursula, you are still clearing and controlling the board. Also, the questing for 2 is very nice. Also, the bouncing back ability and replaying is nice, especially when you do that with Snake. Very, very powerful ability to just really help clear the board up. At the same time, there are a lot of times where Medusa might not even have as, preferable of a target as, a Lady Tremaine, even though it's your opponent gets to pick. If your opponent only has 1 creature, 1 character out onto the board, that's the one that gets taken out, whereas Medusa wouldn't be able to take that out necessarily if it had 4 or more attack. Lady Tremaine, if there's only a Maui on board, Lady Tremaine can take out the Maui. And I really think that was the biggest thing, especially because if the Lady Tremaine doesn't end up going off, then you also still have the Sisu, which can clean up everything else as well. One other big thing that I do want to talk about with this deck before we move on is how crucial and vital Library actually is. Absolutely love the work that Library was able to put in for this deck. We have seen actually a little bit of a fallout with this deck with Library. I think that's about to change. I think people, especially when they felt like this meta was going so much faster with the set 6 release of Azurite Sea, that Library was now too slow. That is not the case, and I think it comes back down to the basic foundation of those who have more cards will win the game. If you have more options in your hand, then you are able to utilize your ink that much more efficiently and deal with your opponent's board that much better. At the same time, I think one thing that we need to discuss as well is that the power of locations is almost underrealized. The fact that you are able to attack in to your to a location means very well that your opponent is not getting lore, and that's a game changer. Okay, your opponent's attacking into your library, and they have to spend 3, 4 attacks to take out your library. Even if they do end up utilizing a crab. At the same time, though, they are not using that to deal with your board or gaining lore. and that can really slow them down. Meanwhile, if they choose to ignore that, you are gaining 1 lore, which can be a very big game changer. If you end up getting the library out on turn 3, turn 4, and the game ends up going another 6, 7 rounds, and the library stays out there, that's another 6, 7 lore that you're getting. And at the same time, even if they choose to ignore that even further and try to deal with your board, then you're immediately replacing everything while they're attacking into it. And your cost effectiveness of this deck is so high that you are able to just bombard the board in the best way possible, you know? And that's one of the biggest things about this deck that I just absolutely love. And again, if you need to know how to properly play this deck, watch this guy's games. He has actually a lot of games on YouTube right now, especially for all the tournaments that he's been able to enter. You look up his name, you'll be able to see his gameplay footage. You'll be able to watch his interviews. You'll be able to see all of his thought processes and what he thinks about certain things and why he does certain plays. Dissect what he does, because if you are a Ruby Amethyst player, watch this guy, and you will become a better player by doing so. And I think that's also one of the hardest things too, especially as you know continually watch other YouTubers. They're not necessarily going to be the most efficient YouTubers. I myself am not a very, I don't consider myself an incredibly efficient Lorcana player. Do I consider myself a good Lorcana player? Yes, I do. Do I consider myself a great one? Not just yet. And that's just because, with the amount of games that I've been able to put into this, I'm still learning the most optimal lines. If you even happen to make a mistake on just your mulligans, whereas like, Ed would keep certain cards for certain reasons and you would just discard them, not realizing those certain lines, you already from turn 1 being less efficient. And that can be an absolute game changer, especially if you are already digging yourself a little bit of a hole from turn 1. Still, though, absolutely masterclass on how to play this deck. One of the most amazing things that I've been able to see, and you get to see him try to take down each and every individual deck, pretty much in this meta, because you were able to see him go against the discard, the Ruby Sapphire, and things like that. Just really great to see. Absolute great gameplay. Now, with that though, he did end up going against a Ruby Sapphire by Scott. And now, this is actually a deck that I absolutely love. I want to see more of this. It is an expensive deck. That is one thing to keep in mind. But it does what it does so well, especially once you start getting to 5, 6, 7 ink. That's when the game can really start changing. And if it can turn out to be turn 4 that you're starting to get out your Mauis on the board, or you're starting to get, your half sharks on turn 5, things like that, you can really start to cascade this into a crazy board change in a matter of 2, 3 moves. And I really like how this is going. Now, of course, the one Queen of Hearts, interesting. You do end up seeing it coming out where he did have it in his opening hand 1 game. Cool. That's awesome. But still, the 1, it's like you're not going to necessarily see it a lot, and if you do, you're probably just going to either put it at the bottom of your deck if it's from a action, or it's just going to become ink. Either or, that's fine. You don't necessarily feel too bad about that. Now, the Sisu Daring Visitor is absolutely a crucial card as well, especially with the 3 ice blocks that you are playing. The ability to even, by turn 3, turn 4, you might even have 2 ice blocks out. And if you have 2 ice blocks out and a Sisu, then you're able to pretty much take out any character on the board. What's also interesting, though, is that he is only playing 2 Sisus. Now, this is an uninkable card, and that can be a pretty big game changer right there, just because you don't want to bog down your hand too much with that, especially with how many actions can necessarily be uninkable. That can really hurt you and slow you down. At the same time, though, when she does come in, she does an absolute good job, and you're not necessarily going to be utilizing her for the shift 6 of the big Sisu. You could, and it's great if you do, but it's not necessarily vital to your gameplay. And so it's just really interesting to see how this is going to end up doing. Hiram, this is one of the keys of the deck. If you did not have Hiram in this deck, he would be a lot less efficient. He would be a lot lower on the totem, and this deck would still be good, but it wouldn't be nearly as great as it is. The fact that I think the biggest thing that makes this card so meta is that the fact that it can be activated upon entering the field. As soon as it comes in, it doesn't even have to quest. it can sack an item and draw you 2 cards. That alone is great. Then the fact also that whenever you quest, you can also get rid of an item. Okay, cool. Sign me up. You know, also the fact that he is a 1/6. It's just absolutely broken. Now, Maui Half Shark. This is one of the craziest cards to have to go against, one of the hardest things to go against. At the same time, you're pretty much going to have to use a Zeus to get rid of it, and that can be a pretty big game changer for you as well. But the hard part about this card is that it does so much for a 6 cost. One, it is a 7/5, so it's going to be able to remove anything. It can pretty much remove a library on its own, but it can remove 90% of locations on its own, no problem. At the same time, it is evasive. And whenever you challenge another character, you can return an action card from your discard to your hand. And then whenever you play an action, you can gain 1 lore. So at the start of your turn, you have Maui out, he's ready to attack. You send him into an exerted character, you get back something, you play it, you fill up your hand a little bit more, you do the action, whatever it might be. It might be, a brawl, whatever. And you gain a lore on top of that, There's just a lot of utilization, and the fact that he's evasive just makes him so difficult to have to take out, where you're having to rely on your Elses, you're having to rely on your other evasive characters just to be able to do the 5 damage. At the same time, do not feel like you are unobligated to sacrifice your popsicles to remove 2 damage as well, which can also be a very utilized line as well. That's one of the best things that you can do with this deck. Just absolutely efficient, absolutely powerful. Sizu can also be utilized incredibly well with ice blocks as well. You see that you have a Calhoun out on a board, you're at the 8 ink, tap the ice block, you -1 from Calhoun, then you get to clear out even more of their board than you necessarily were able to previously. Tamatoa, same thing, you're just going to be able to recycle back. He's not necessarily being used to quest for a lot, but it is very nice to be able to quest for a lot with him. At the same time, anytime that he does quest, or when he does come into the battlefield, you are able to dig for a item that you have passed on, of course, and da-da-da-da-da. Vitalosphere, not all the time is it utilized, but at the same time, the fact that it's able to gain rush and +2 attack can be an absolute game changer. Hideaway is always nice just to get rid of locations, especially now. I guarantee we're going to be seeing every Ruby Amethyst deck running, library again for no obvious reason, But Hideaway will be becoming a lot more utilized once more. Now, Sail the Azurite Sea, staple, plain and simple. The fact that it is, pretty much a common card, and it's going for 41 cents says so much about this deck and how much it is in demand. At the same time, everything else is actually pretty standard, and this deck just goes very efficiently on the ramp. You discard what you can from your starting hand to get the ramp that you need to be able to utilize everything properly so that you can build your board up as fast as possible and take out your opponent. If you're able to get a Be Prepared out on, turn 5 or 6, and you're going against Steel Song, or you're going against any Amber deck, any aggro deck really, then they're absolutely just taken care of. If you're able to also get a Maui out and just start taking things out one at a time, cool, that's awesome. There's just not a whole lot that they can really do to answer back to this. And then once you get to the end game, you're drawing so efficiently and you're playing so many cards to get removal, to get control, that it is just so hard for your opponents to even catch up, which is just crazy. Now, this was very interesting. Zan is an absolute masterful pilot. He did so good being able to play this deck. Now, at the same time, what was really interesting too, there was one guy on the Amethyst side. He lost his game just because he was it the Amethyst? It was probably Ruby Amethyst, I think. No, it was it was Amethyst Steel or something like that. Anyway, I forget. I watched a lot of games today, but the Diablo just came in so clutch because it ended up that the other player ended up going and trying to just dig to try to get something, and he ended up digging 4 cards deep. His opponent got 4 cards because of Diablo, and that was game. He basically dug his own grave at that point. Even though he got the removal, the Diablo had already done its job and given him the cards that he needed to be able to get ahead. Biggest thing though, Calhoun is just absolutely insane. Puts in the work and is able to just really, people are almost, here's the hard part. I think people are almost too scared to quest with Calhoun. It is a good thing to be weary of, Trust me, like it is something to be mindful of, especially if you don't have the removal, it can be a very scary thing to have to actually deal with. But at the same time, you need to be able to play your game properly before you again dig your own grave because your opponent is able to quest a bit. There was a game that I had recently where we each had a Calhoun out on the board, and he wasn't questing at all, and I was. And for whatever reason, he was just more terrified about questing. And so it's just interesting. And it can just be such a steel-headed front for you to be able to have. Slight pun. Anyway, go go. Go go can be really good, especially towards the late game, especially if you're going against purple. If they have an Elsa out and you're able to put 3-4 damage on Elsa, and go go being able to gain 3 or 4 lore just by 2, boom, powerful. Now the hard part is this is one of the hardest decks to actually pilot, and you're almost it's kind of the same as Ruby Amethyst necessarily, where you are hoping for so much to actually go right. That's the hardest part. If things aren't necessarily going right with your draws and with what you're able to find and utilize, then you're just going to end up putting yourself further and further behind. And that's going to be one of the hardest parts. At the same time, guys, Diablo's, you know, Diablo is not the most broken card. It is, yes, I will agree, one of the best cards in the game at this very moment. The fact that you can shift by discarding an action card, it's evasive. But the nice part is though it doesn't have ward or anything like that. So, and its ability has to be activated when it is exerted. That's a big difference, and that's why yes, it is a broken card. I will not necessarily say that it is a bannable card. One card that they did mess up on, Prince John. Why? One, he has ward. Two, and I think this is the biggest thing, either give someone ward and give them an ability that activates when they are exerted, or don't give them ward and have them have their ability when they are unexerted. The fact that Prince John can literally just be readied the entire time and his ability is just there and there is literally nothing you can do about it. Dang. That absolutely sucks, and there's not a whole lot that you can do. And it's until your opponent literally gets into a dangerous part that they end up having to like quest with him or something along those lines to try to get a little bit more ahead. It's just so hard for you to actually have to do. It's dumb. But, this is the game that you end up having to play, and that's just how it is. So, anyway, all in all, though, that's the card I don't think should necessarily be banned, but it needs to be errated to where it just removes ward. I think if you just remove ward, it would be so much better. That or make his ability be exerted. The Muses, absolutely powerhouse. Same thing as Prince John, and why I also hate this card because it has ward. And whenever you play a song, you may return chosen character with 2 or less to their player's hand. You kidding me? You kidding me? So it's just dumb. I absolutely hate this just because it's a really good theme card, but not beyond that. It's just really annoying. Same thing as Prince John, and it's just so hard to take out. I hate it. Anyway, back to this though. The pilot did an absolutely really good job being able to utilize his deck, and he was able to make it absolutely far and prove exactly why he deserved to be, in the top 16. Just because, you know, this deck, going back to what we've been talking about, is so hard to pilot, and he was able to do so against a very competitive meta, and he was able to do so successfully. This deck has fallen off of the tier list a little bit from what we've seen, and it's very noticeable as to why, especially for the reasons that we've discussed. It's just not nearly as fast, and you're hoping a lot more goes right for it. Still, though, if you have the right pilot being able to utilize this deck, it is absolutely deadly. And so I just love to be able to see what this is able to do and how Zed was able to actually play Zan. Zan was able to utilize this deck. Also interesting, 20 uninkables. Just putting that out there. So at the same time now, the interesting one of Amethyst Steel. Now go ahead and take a look at both of these decks. We're only going to take a look at one, but take a look at both of them on your own time. Really, really interesting because they both are trying to do almost the same thing, but in a different way. Um, and I really like what we're going to be looking at Zach, what he actually ended up doing with his deck. Now, of course, it's Amethyst. We've already seen an Amethyst. We're not going to dive too much into it, but you know, again though, we are seeing 11 1-drops. Calhoun, 3 of them, absolutely vital, very good. 4 snakes, 4 Smees. Now, Smee is absolutely a powerhouse as well, being able to quest for 2. And a lot of the times, even though he is taking 1 damage, 2 damage, depending on how many turns he's out, kind of thing, people are going to be trading into him. It doesn't matter that he has 2 damage on him. You're going to see people trading into him and just, having him, you know, quest for 2, quest for 4 kind of thing, and still trading into another character to help control the board. For 2, I mean, that's just crazy. One of the best cards in the deck. One of the best cards in this color. And there's a reason why he's a 4 of in every steel deck. Lawrence, we saw Lawrence actually fall away a little bit at the start of Sale of the Azurite Sea, or the the Azurite Sea set. Um, he kind of made a little bit of a comeback around Vegas and things like that. But I remember even the commentators around Vegas and Seattle were a little dumbfounded a little bit at Lawrence and how wasteful of a card he seemed to be. I remember a deck where someone was literally playing 2 Lawrences and they're like, why are they necessarily doing that? As soon as he hurt, he does literally 0 damage. But it goes back to even what we were talking about previously, where Lawrence, someone has to trade into him, or you have to use some kind of utility. If you use a Zeus on Lawrence, cool, that's great. If you end up using a Fire of the Cannons or something like that to remove the damage and then give an attack in, cool, then you're wasting an attack and you're wasting a card that could be spent elsewhere. At the same time, once Lawrence actually comes in, he avoids things like the Sisus because he has 4 attack and things of that nature as well. Just absolutely great card. And if he's able to quest and then get some board control or have someone waste some attacks on him, more power to him. Absolutely great card. Love him. And I love him at 4. I feel like he should have been at 4 in the decks a lot sooner. 3 Merlin Crabs, 4 Peats, and this is an absolutely vital card, especially when you are going against, the Ruby Sapphires, and the Ruby Amethyst decks, or even, Steel Song. Especially if they go turn 3 Aerial and you go turn 3 Pete, cool, you know. And there was even one game where I was going against Ruby Amethyst, and I played 3 Petes in a row by bouncing and everything like that, and my opponent had Be Prepared and songs in his hand and whatnot, and he could not take care of my board, and it got me that much closer to winning the game. Just absolutely great. 2 White Roses, love this card. 3/3 for 3, and it gains 1. It's kind of the same as Genie though, where he's very easy to kind of take out, and if he gets bounced back, there's not a whole lot that ends up happening. Other than that though, everything else is pretty standard. Strength of a Raging Fire has really climbed up the meta. I think this is one card that we are going to necessarily talk about here. Strength of a Raging Fire, we kind of didn't really see it again at the beginning of the of Azurite Sea. It was a good card, but as soon as people realized how many characters you could potentially be having out by turn 2, turn 3, even especially like turn 4, you could have 4 characters out onto the board, and even your Rabbit, your Lawrence or something along those lines could necessarily even sing the song as well. And that has absolutely drawn it up in price. That's the hard part about that. But especially just with how fast these cards are, how much you're able to build up your board, it's just an absolutely powerhouse of a card to just help gain back control and to get ahead in the game. And then of course Zeus, great card, does 5 damage for 4 and can be sung. Enough said. Great deck though. I feel like it's getting there. Again, though, it's just really having a hard time with consistency. And if you end up, just not drawing well, and if you end up or just not having a good start, then you're just going to dig yourself a hole, and it's going to be incredibly difficult for you to be able to get out. I think that's the biggest problem with this deck right now. Just that's the hardest part. This is a deck I play, and this is one of the most punishing decks if you don't draw well. Plain and simple. Now, at the same time, we got a Blurple. Yeah. Blurple is an absolutely interesting concept of deck. You get the ramp of blue, and you get the bounce of purple. And it seems like it is a great idea. And in reality, it actually is. The difficult part about this, though, is that they don't really have necessarily a whole ton of board control until the very end of the game. And the hard part with this deck is if you end up missing your ramp or if you end up going against discard. If you go against discard, game will probably pretty much be over, unfortunately, because you are relying on so much of your ramp, so much of the ability to ink the cards in your hand that you almost just get in too much trouble if you end up having to discard cards. Even going against Merfolk kind of in the EA decks can be a pretty difficult mountain for you to climb. And rightfully so, because if you don't have cards in your hand, then you're just in trouble. At the same time, though, this is still a very efficient and very good deck, especially once it is able to get to the end game. One thing that's really interesting, too, is we're seeing Donald Duck actually come back into the meta. He disappeared at the end of set 5 and just was nowhere to be seen in set 6, but this just kind of helps more with the consistency, putting a body out on the board, and being able to put the top card of your deck into your inkwell face down. Also, being able to quest for 2 is really nice. Being a 3/4, 4 willpower is an absolute game changer, just because in the sense of there's not a whole lot of things that necessarily do 4. It's like, yes, you have a fox necessarily, but you're going to just trade into it. And you're okay with that. If a fox ends up getting out a Donald, you're almost more okay. As soon as it gets its ink out, being able to put something in the inkwell, great. That's awesome. If it does end up having or being able to quest, awesome. That's almost a little bit more of a perk, but you're playing this more just to help guarantee the ramp a little bit more. Again, though, we are seeing a little bit of a problem with the genies here, just in the sense of it is so easy to get them to bounce back. There have been so many EA games that I've casted and everything like that where, Kit just comes in and bounces him back as soon as he's played, and you pay for it to draw one. Ugh, no, not for me. And also, I mean, there's Zeus's. There's just so much that is able to actually take him out, to where the 4 cost just really almost slows you down. Don't get me wrong, and don't hate me in the comments saying I don't know what I'm talking about, or Genie is the best card in the set. Yes, I agree. Genie is an absolute great card in the set. At the same time, though, if he is unable to start questing, it slows your game down so much that it can be absolutely detrimental. That's why it's really curious that we didn't necessarily see in the Amethyst Steel 4 genies, or in the Ruby Amethyst that took first 4 genies. We didn't see any genies in that set. So this is just really interesting and something to absolutely keep in mind. Now, of course, at the same time, too, for Elsa's, absolutely vital, especially on the control, and being able to shift into Big Elsa. Big Elsa is pretty much one of the biggest cards in this deck that can just lock down your board. Um, it it just slows people down from their win cons, and the ability that you are able to then play a snake. You want to save your snakes until the end game, because if you have Hades that you're getting out on the field, if you have Elsa's that you're getting out on the field, you can just stop your opponent's goal. And that is an absolute game changer. Elsa's one of the best ones. And then, of course, you can stop your opponent from questing. You can then, on your following turn, quest for 3, play a snake, bounce it back, and then if you have 10 or more lore, you're able to play it again. And then stop your opponent even further. It's just absolutely insane. Yes, it doesn't have evasive like the smaller Elsa, but you don't necessarily need it. The fact that it is able to do deep freeze, stopping 2 characters from readying up, that is tough to have to deal with. And if you can keep doing that over and over again, then the game is pretty much yours. And so, anyway, everything else is pretty much standard here. Now, of course, 3 McDuck banners is absolutely interesting, and it is interesting because of 9. If you are able to get McDuck banner out on turn 3, yes, you might be necessarily be slowing down, but your opponent might not have a whole ton of removal, and even if McDuck banner goes off 2, 3 times, it's paid for itself by far. especially with how much this deck can absolutely gain control. Now, of course, guys, our last deck that we are going to be looking at, we're not going to be looking at EA necessarily. We're going to be looking at Amber Steel by Kurt, just as a kind of reference. Now, of course, keep in mind that, yes, this is a very standard Dwarven Mine version of Amber Steel. And so this is something that, you don't necessarily see varied too much, and why we aren't going to necessarily spend too much time on it. It is very interesting, though, that we didn't necessarily see it make really a dent on the top 8. Uh, when it came time to perform, it's like the other decks just ended up doing better, and rightfully so. They were able to control the boards a lot better. Now, what was really interesting, though, and one thing that I do really like that they actually did here was running John Silvers. He's a very cheap card, don't get me wrong, and a 3/3 for 3, kind of a White Rose persona, if you will. But at the same time, what is really interesting about him is when you play this character, chosen character can't challenge during their next turn. Absolute game changer there. That can stop a Maui in their track. That can stop anything that is scary, Fox, anything like that, that is, threatening your board, and you can just continue to steamroll through. Really cool. Again, for Lawrence, this is an absolute game changer as well. For Pete's, you need to be able to counter your opponent's steel songs. You need to be able to counter, be prepared, and things like that, and just prolong the inevitable because you are able to then get ahead. Now, Chimpo is actually a really interesting add. At the same time, though, do I feel like 5 is a bit too slow for this deck? Yes and no. At the same time, do I feel like Chimpo is the correct course of action here? Not necessarily. I almost feel like Kita would be a little bit better here. At the same time, this person made top 16 and I didn't. But Chimpo is an absolutely great powerhouse of a card because it stops opponents in their tracks, and they have to take care of it before they can take care of the rest of your board. Even if they end up having to use a Zeus, even if they have to end up running a Fox into it and something else, if they ended up going a Smee and a Fox into something, into your Chimpo, that's a lot of utilization just gone. That paid for itself with 5 for 5 right there. And you could even see more than that as well. And so it's just really interesting to be here. Also, the one thing that is a game changer about Chimpo, unlike Pluto, is that he doesn't lose any of his attack once he takes damage, and he avoids Medusas, which is an absolute game changer. And I really think that's the biggest reason why Chimpo was actually put in this deck. He avoids pretty much all the removal. You would have to use 2 ice blocks even to get, a brawl necessarily utilized here. So the one thing that I really like that they added here was Rapunzel's Tower. Why is that? It's because Rapunzel's Tower costs, barely anything, and any character that is there, and it only costs 1 to move, gets +3 willpower. +3! You put a Chimpo there and you have to do 10 damage against it. And also on top of that, Rapunzel's Tower ends up actually putting in work as well. It doesn't have like the most health necessarily, but 8 is still very difficult to have to actually deal with. At the same time, too, 7 Dwarves Mine, even at 6, is almost a little bit difficult to deal with. But the Rapunzel Tower can absolutely be a game changer as well. Just being able to give your guys so much tougher to be able to take out. You put a Daisy there, turn 2. Imagine if you played a Daisy turn 2, and it had 7 health, and then you played, a Cinderella on top of that kind of thing. What? Or even like a Cinderella being a 1/5 on turn 2. I mean, the fact that you don't see more, Steel Songs or Mines even running this deck, I mean, yes, it can necessarily slow you down, especially when you're not necessarily going to be inking nearly as much, but you're only running 2, so the odds of you seeing it might not be the highest. But if you do, it really can help your game right there, which is why I absolutely love it. And so, I mean, all in all, guys, this was an absolutely intense North American Championship, and I love how much gameplay we were able to see and how wide this meta is right here, right now. It is absolutely incredible to be able to see what all, this meta has been able to do. And I am so excited to see what's going to be going on, especially in this next set, which is going to be releasing in the beginning/middle of the month of March. So what did you guys think about the NA Championships? What do you guys also think about the meta right now? How do you feel about things? Let me know down in the comments. And if you feel so inclined, feel free to like and subscribe to this video. It would mean an absolute lot. Anyway, guys, have a good one, and